Remembering from our previous lesson that floodplains are flat areas. And I can see over here, there's this flat area before you get to the hills. On here, I see a flat area, like right there and right there. Here, flat, 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 flat. So they are a flat area. And they're an area that, because they're so flat and they're next to the river, if the river got too much water from, a lot of rain, the river could just flow into that flat area and it could get flooded very easily. I remember when we talked about this in our previous lesson, we also reminded ourselves of our third grade study of Egypt and the idea that the Nile River would flood. And if you think back to that lesson about Egypt, there was a positive of that river flooding. The river was carrying sediment. Sediment had been eroded by the river, and the river was carrying that sediment. And so when the river flooded and went over to the banks into the floodplain, it had sediment with it, and it deposited that sediment into the floodplain, which then meant that there were lots of nutrients for growing crops. But the problem was that things can happen to like buildings. You want to live in a floodplain because the soil is so good, but you don't want to live in a floodplain because of this. These are houses that are in a floodplain in Missouri, and when the river flooded, this is what happened. You can see the cars are underwater. These are garages, but houses would also be underwater. And then you might think, oh, not a big deal that the houses are underwater because the water can just go away. But the thing is that, remember, that water is carrying sediment in it. So this is a house where the water has actually left, and you can see what it leaves behind. It's not just water. It doesn't just dry and everything's fine. It's water with sediment. So it leaves sediment on everything it touches. And so floods can cause a lot of damage. This is a map of Boston, and all the parts that are light blue, those are all parts of Boston. Actually, the dark blue, I'll tell you first, is the harbor. So that's the Boston Harbor, which is connected to the ocean. So that's water. The light blue is not water. That's actually land, but that is land that is very low lying. And so if the ocean gets higher, sorry, be quiet. If the ocean gets higher, those areas could flood. So flooding is a very real issue, not just for places like Missouri that have a river. They are also an issue for places like Boston that are near the ocean. So today's lesson is going to be about floods and how we can help prevent damage. We can't make sure the floods don't happen because that's up to weather, but we can make sure that they don't cause as much damage. One way that we can prevent damage from floods is to make sure that the water doesn't actually go into the houses as much. And one thing that can help with that is having wetlands around. Wetlands are areas where the soil can soak up a lot of water. You might have heard of swamps or marshes or bogs. Those are all examples of wetland. You know that it's very mushy and there's lots of water in the soil. The soil acts kind of like a sponge. It can absorb water into it. So I'm actually going to do a model of how this works, why areas that have wetlands don't flood as much. And I'm going to use a sponge as my model of the wetland. So I'm going to try to get this so you see it. So down here, I have two containers. One has a sponge. What is that modeling? That's my wetland. And one has clay, which is kind of hard. Most of our soil is actually pretty hard. The water doesn't go in very well, and it usually has rock underneath the soil, underneath a little layer of soil, and so it can't take up very much water. It can't absorb very much water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour water on these equal amounts of water, so it's a fair test. And we're going to see which one floods the house. Here we go. We're going to start with the clay. I don't know if you can see there, but the water actually went all the way up to the roof of the house. Now we are going to try with the wetland. I'm going to pour water on like it's a flood. We're going to see what happens. And the house did not get any water in it. I'm going to pull these two houses up for you, and you can see the difference. This one, completely wet. See, as I shake it, this one, no water. So the wetland actually absorbed the water, and then the water didn't flood into the house. Go back to your tab to answer some questions.